or both of those are valid. So animals versus individuals with value. You can ask a person, tell me why I cannot hurt my neighbor outside of the law. If the law did not exist, why should I not hurt my neighbor? That's a terrible example. But there are people who will argue, particularly atheists, who will argue that there's nothing wrong with, how would we say, with violating that sacred nature in so many different ways, such as if a child is already born up to the age of 2, you should be able to take that life because it's not a functioning human being, doesn't have a prefrontal cortex, therefore it doesn't have value. In the same way, when a person reaches old age, they're in a wheelchair or they have cancer, they're dying, they don't have value to society, they're not a fully functioning human being, therefore we have the opportunity, we have the right to take their life. That's a really slippery slope, particularly if you have like racism involved with that, as history would show us. Like I said, all is lost in death if we do not believe in God, and there's intrinsic value does not exist. So, I skipped my story to talk about why if there is no God, we have no meaning. We have no reason to live. I really skipped over that. I was writing that paper on Friedrich Nietzsche, who said that God is dead. He said very many interesting things. He said one thing I find really interesting. He said that after these great men of the 20th century came, there would come another type of person in the last days. It almost sounds like Revelation. I think he was referring to maybe 50 years in the future when he was alive in the 1880s. He didn't know what he was talking about. He went insane and died. He said dementia. He could only write for about a few minutes at a time because he had such severe headaches his entire life. So you will also often see him scribbling for 2 lines, and then he couldn't focus anymore. He's a really strange man. But what he said was eventually people would forget being heroes. They would become just very boring people, and they would become, as one person later said, they don't want revolutions. They don't want big ideas. They don't want any of that. They're not even interested in any kind of religion or what he would talk about. He was an atheist, the person who was saying it. They just sit at home and watch French soap operas because he lived in France. They just sit at home and watch TV. And I was like, that's kind of maybe true. I don't know. Anyway, so I was writing this paper. Nobody talks about this guy unless you're in like a college class because he's, from a long time ago. And I was sitting there in Prince Street Cafe, if you're familiar with it, and I was typing away. I finally had time to do my homework because in the week, it had been very busy. I was around people the whole time, and I could put my headphones in, and I could just zone out, and I could finally get this paper done. And it was very full. I was sitting right at the front at that one little table that's there with 2 chairs, and I was just ignoring everyone. This one man walks up, and he says, can I have this? And I thought he meant take the chair. I said, yeah, take the chair. And he goes, okay, and he sits down, and he looks at me. And I was like, why are you sitting down, and why are you looking at me? As was my first thought. And he just kind of starts talking, and I had to remove my headphones. He's like, yeah, I was doing this today, and I was doing the other thing, and I ended up coming here. I'm going to meet some buddies later, but this, and he had this whole long thing. I was like, okay, so what do you do? He says, well, he had a job maybe, or actually, I think he was in just community college, and he's taking some classes. I said, what classes are you taking? He said, I'm taking this, I'm taking philosophy. And I said, do you have a person you like in philosophy? He said, yeah, Friedrich Nietzsche. I said, oh, wow, that's very interesting. And he said, yeah, he really embraced the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche, which was this: I make my own self, pull my own self up by my bootstraps. I create my own kind of identity. I create my own morality. I said, isn't that kind of scary to create your own morality and your own meaning? And it's like, yeah, but it's being a real man. It's like you're taking charge of your own destiny. It's not like a cop-out like Christianity where you're told what you are, is kind of what his idea was, but I make it myself. Wow, that's really scary. I said, isn't that a pretty slippery slope? And he said, but he was out to be the Superman. I was like, right. And I had like 2 or 3 value or something, to appeal to that says I should live. He says, I don't know. He also said that he struggles with depression and he has trouble, kind of going through life. He said there is an obvious contradiction in that worldview where you say, I'm a better person, I'm a strong person because I can make myself, but in the end, I have no way of saving myself. And that's the case with teenagers and anyone who's struggling with that sense of meaning, is that they don't have anything higher to appeal to. So in relativity, all the things you appeal to for value are on your level. So let's say I have a sense of meaning that comes from my career or job. Let's say I'm an NFL player, and I look around and I have my stats, my record, I have a few Super Bowls wins under my belt or whatever, and I have incredible meaning in that, and everybody sees me and everybody knows me, and I say, I've got it made. I've got it made. And I go through that, and I value myself on that sort of that NFL sort of identity. I should use the NBA, because I once accidentally through Uber, not accidentally, met a father of a player who won the NBA championship in 2004. Who knows who won? Anyone? No idea. You might be right. They beat Michael Jordan, or someone, Shaq, not Michael Jordan. This guy, this old man, or he was old, his son, he said, my son beat Shaq and all those boys. So that's a pretty good story to tell. If you're Richard Hamilton, I think, but that was the name. He said, my son beats, Shaq and the squad, or whoever it was back then, he beat them. It's like, yeah. He lives in Coatesville. That's where he grew up, and it was very interesting. I read the bio, and I was like, wow, that's a great story and everything, but nobody knows. I asked a group of people, and there was only one boy who knew who Richard Hamilton was. That's because he was really into basketball. But the rest of the people were like, what? What appeal? How can you appeal to meaning to something that's so far back in your life that nobody cares? They look at you and they go, what do you matter? The only people who continue to be able to be valued by that are those who get the commentating jobs during the football games, like Tony Dungy or someone like that, and they can kind of preserve that little bit of value and honor that they have, and eventually it just kind of fades away. There are so many other things that you could place your value in, and we in the church could place our value in these things. Like, this is really a universal problem. Where does my value and identity come from? You could be, I don't know, I don't want to pick on anyone, but you could be, I could include myself in this because I'm standing up here. You could be like a person who, when they're, not me, this is not me, this doesn't happen. There's a problem in the church. There's a troubled person, and they come to you for help. Or you serve the church, or you serve people. People look up to you, and they go, there's a wise man who's raised his family right. He's done it right, Or he gets behind the pulpit if he's a preacher, and the whole congregation is crying, because it's so touching and moving. Okay, I'm just making things up. But you could have your ability and even your sway or power in the church. You could point to your value in that because it's so spiritual. I once heard a sermon or a chapel by a speaker, and I never forget it. He said there's two idolatries. There's the idolatry that's out there, that's the idol, that's the pagan worship. And there's the idolatry of the spirituality, which sits right next to the real thing. What he was saying was, I can worship all the things I do, quote, in ministry, I can worship that as a place where it gives me value when I've completely missed the person of Christ who's standing next to that and saying, what are you doing, you self-righteous hypocrite? I'm over here. And you kind of get the sense of pride, and you have, I know of, for sure, I met this man. I shook his hand, I said, sir, you are my hero. Maybe a little much to say. And I continued to read his book. I would listen to his podcast, his sermons all the time, and I would look forward to it. I would use the examples, I would think about them, I would use little bits of them when I was talking to people and all that. And I would, on the way home, when I had maybe evangelized or like a church event or something like that, that's what I would listen to every Sunday night at 8:42 after a choir program. That's where he was. I'd listen to him. He played a pretty big role in my life, I guess. Because of that, I went to England and I looked into his study center. And then one day, after I saw him, University of Delaware, shook his hand, right during COVID, he died. I was so sad. I watched the funeral, Mike Pence was there, and I was just like, wow, it's so sad, he'll never get to preach again. His preaching was powerful. This is probably the greatest example of idolatry and ministry you will ever hear in hopefully our lifetime. Hopefully there's no one worse. Later came out that he was this man, Ravi Zacharias, was unfaithful to his wife on a regular basis, constantly. In his second phone, there were images of women and that he had bought things for in different countries. And everybody was shocked. How could this man of God do it? His wife and the people, some of them still cannot believe that this man could look like such a good Christian and look like he had such value. But the reason he had value in our kind of Christian sphere is that because he could do something, right? He could talk to a crowd. He was one of the few people who could go to university and just speak and have everybody listen and have people, secular atheist students, line up and ask questions with a general demeanor of respect. The only person, he had value to the Christian community, which was good. There's nothing wrong with that, but that was what he worshipped. And when you look into his private life, there was God, his God, and then there was his actual pleasure and satisfaction. He had great value over here, and somehow that justified some very horrible sin. And it's disgusting if you read into the report. And my world kind of crumbled for a few days. I was just like, really? Is there anyone out there, any leader in the church, anybody at all who's truly sincere and has a value in Christ? And like the great people we think we know, like D.L. Moody in the past, and those who seem to deflect any kind of that lifestyle of worshiping their own works. And I had to think, this came to me later, and this is an obvious example. Who was the greatest missionary of all time? Not talking about Jesus. No, I'm thinking really far back. Yes. So, Paul wrote like a lot of letters in the New Testament, right? He went all over the unknown world planting churches. If you read that section where he says, I have been thrice, shipwrecked, and he has all these things, and he was bitten by the snake, and on and on and on. You look at his life and you go, now that is incredible. How do you carry that weight on your shoulders and not find your value in that? I was thinking about that for a while. Because if I did that, I'd be like, I planted a church here, I planted a church here, my value and meaning is just going up, 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 up. I really feel great about what I did. I mean, just imagine the thrill. Do I worship that thrill? And I think that's another part of it. I just worship the experience. I've forgotten God. And this is what the statement I came up with after I thought about that for a while. Any applause, any pridefulness, anything like that, first of all, was against like common sense. Like, that's not for me, it's the work of God, okay? But any of that was outweighed by the sacred trust of God in the calling of Paul's life. Any sort of selfishness, any sort of ambition, any sort of idol worship was completely outweighed and made to look like the dirt it was because of the honor that God had placed on his life in being this great tool of the early church and planting early churches that we still read about today. Like the weight of looking at the world and seeing that Christ died for that world, we still have that weight. So no matter how many times we evangelize, no matter how many times we preach, no matter how many times we do anything in what we would call Christian works, we don't find our value in that because we look out and we see what the field, which is ripe for harvest, and we see our work is not done, our calling is sacred, and our value comes from Christ. And I didn't have that in my notes, but that's something I was thinking about. Let's not worship the idol of our own works and our own spirituality, because it's really easy to do. And if we do, we'll get a big head, and eventually we'll kind of start unwinding, and we'll resort to sin. Here's another thought that comes from objectivity. Today, when people lose their meaning, their sense of individuality, their sense of any sense of being made in the image of God, what happens? They have to look where for some sense of belonging. This happens a lot, and this can still happen. It still happens anywhere, really. In middle school, we form little groups. We form little cliques because we have to find some identity and protection from the other people. But that's kind of what happens as adults today, where people don't have a sense of meaning. They look to their they're kind of like maybe check boxes, like I'm this ethnicity, I have this political view, I'm oppressed in this way, I have these rights. And they form groups, and it's not about the individual. So they say statements that can never be solved and that are really always a losing game. Things like, okay, I don't want to say some obvious ones, not the best, but if we were to say that America is an oppressive nation, the whole group of Americans, they're all oppressive. All they do is bad things. I can't in of myself, if I find my identity in my group, I can't in of myself make everyone else healthy. I can't make everyone in my group not racist. This is kind of the one that's the big deal right now. But the point is this: if you look into your group to find identity, you also have a great problem. This is shared with society, where people don't have a sense of individuality. They've been isolated as individuals, even though they're surrounded by people. What that means is their individual needs are not met because they've formed a group that's supposed to solve all that. You could say that about your church, say about anything. I've joined this church because it's kind of my identity, it's my religion, it's my very narrow kind of culture. It's a combination of all that, and that's where I fit. And if I didn't have that, I wouldn't know how I would have value. That's kind of hard to separate in your mind because probably your whole life you've been part of a church or some sort of group. In our society, there's no individual, it's always the group, and when the group is pitted against another group, it's like a tribal warfare, and eventually the person has no identity or no individuality. And the problem is that if they don't think of themselves as an individual, how do they relate to God in that sense? So there was a man a long time ago, he said that the entire world, and when the world comes together, they can see God together. It's like a very horrible statement that kind of was popular at that time. But it's individuals we relate to God. And addressing the person as an individual is incredibly important in our world because they've lost that sense. Because if you're defined by your your ethnicity or your race, etc., you lose that sense of who you are. Okay. So what is the Christian answer to finding meaning in life? Is the world able to answer this question with any satisfaction? They might say happiness. How many of you have been happy for the past year, or month, or week, or 10 minutes? Like fully happy and jubilant? No, it's so conditional. The same thing is with family. If you say, oh, family is where my value is. My values are traditional family, all these conservative things, but not necessarily Christ. You don't have you just value your family. Eventually that family may go away, and you've lost all meaning and all hope. So, what is the answer from Christianity? Well, the world cannot answer it, but the Christian answer is the only answer in the world. And I think when you ask people this question, or they talk about it, they have no answer. In a sense, I think it's probably the most prominent and easy conversation sometimes to have. You say, what are you talking about? I'm saying if university students can't answer this question, and you can, it makes them look like they're not as wise as they think they are. It looks like the Christian worldview has a serious advantage. Not just a serious advantage, they have the whole court. If the world cannot answer if there's meaning in life, and the Christian world can, what does that do? It in a sense, it appeals to a person's inner self. They say, meaning in life? What does that mean? If I was truly satisfied, even in some sense, what does that mean? What do I believe? Am I believing lies? And I found that to be true in a few conversations. But before I get to the actual details of at least my answer, I'd like to share one story. This is probably one of those stories where I was like, I don't think I'm saying, it's not me. This is a really strange experience and coincidental, and it made me feel very what do you call it? Sense of awe or wonder. So this is I'm trying to get this right. I was in Philadelphia, and I picked someone up. I don't remember where. I do remember the trip was about 30 minutes. And as most people do, it takes them a while to kind of open up. And this woman, she kind of opened up slowly, talking about her job, her job. And she worked 2 jobs. And I was like, wow, that sounds difficult. She was explaining how difficult that is. And I was thinking, like, why did she have to work 2 jobs? Did she work for UPS and somewhere else? And she sounded kind of like burdened by that. And she went on to share that she used to be in nursing school. She used to be in nursing school, but she dropped out. And this is kind of where the conversation went into a more personal area. And I was listening to this and saying, why did you, I don't know what I said. I was thinking, why did you drop out of nursing school? That could have had a great future, and I had 2 jobs. She said, I had to take care of both my parents. And when the nursing curriculum got to the part where they talked about tracheotomies, she said, I learned that, and then I left. It's like, okay. She said, both my parents had tracheotomies. She sacrificed her career so she could go home and take care of her parents, which seems like a very honorable, if not, noble sort of thing to do. And she said, I watched them die, and they both died, and they died of old age, or I don't know what illness. And she said this then. She said, then later I got a diagnosis of terminal cancer. And I'm here, and I watched both my parents die, and I know I'm going to die, and I'm just going to work, working 2 jobs. I don't know why. She said, what is the point of this? Like, just like that. She said, I don't know why. Like, what is the meaning of any of this? In a very, clear and broken way. Like, why? Why am I still existing? As though there should be an answer, but there's no answer. And she kind of just left it. Often it's good to just, leave some silence there so you don't say anything too stupid, and you just kind of wait for a little bit. And I thought to myself, I said, ma'am, I know this, that Christ is the only way, first of all, to find any true forgiveness, any peace. And I, talked about that a little bit. She said that she was a Catholic, but she didn't have much knowledge, I don't think. I said to her, I said, look, you have a situation in your life. You have a series of events. You have a series of events that seem not to be connected at all. He said, but if you surrender your life to Christ, there's something that changes that you might not know about. It's that you join his story, and that every event that has ever occurred that was so painful and that was so much suffering has now been redeemed. Because of one, Christ has redeemed your life, and he's taken that whole life, and now he is the writer of that story. That story stretches the whole time. That story is the greatest story of redemption ever, and you can join that story and have a part of redemption. You can change the world with the time you have left, and you can find happiness of a sense, or joy and meaning, and you can find an eternal destiny where it all matters, and none of it, because it led you up to this point, will ever be washed away. That's not exact words I use, something like that. Silence, and I pulled up to her house, and she goes, I was thinking about that today. Before I go, I should make it right with God. And I think that starts here with you in this conversation. I was too stunned to say anything. She didn't pray the sinner's prayer, but she sure was thinking. I don't know whatever happened to that person, but the story is what mattered. The meaning. The meaning of life would be given because Christ died for you. The meaning of life is, first of all, you have the image of God. You are redeemed. You join that story. Suddenly the hand of God, the sovereign Lord, is your story. He's guiding you. You're living. You have that interaction with God, and you have the wonder of how he brought you into the kingdom out of all that meaninglessness. And it's going forever. And the meaning never dies. There's never a time where your value of meaning or identity ever just goes, and you don't have any value. It's not like you're in the NFL or the NBA or anything like that. And I think that's what cued her in, was when you can visualize a sense of a trajectory or a straight, kind of line through your life. There was a young man, he was 17. His name was Finley, and actually I don't know how old he's now, but questions, and then you kind of just think about it. And one day he came up to me and he said, do you believe in fatalism? I was like, fatalism? You mean where all the events of your life have nothing to do with each other, and it's just not an episode or a story or a chapter, it's just kind of a bunch of random events, and then you die and then there's nothing. And I tried to define it as bleak as possible, because I'm like, do you realize what you're saying? I said, do you believe that? He said, I don't know. And he looked really sad, because if it's all just a bunch of random stuff, and then eventually it goes to nothing, that would have a very dramatic effect on how you live your life. And I don't know where he is now, but he would talk about like really deep philosophically. He would read like Marcus Aurelius. I'd never read it. He had incredible things to say. But this is the short answer. Created in the image of God, we can be redeemed to an intimate relationship with God that brings fullness in the life we were meant to live. Created in the image of God, like the woman at the well, she had satisfaction, she had worship. His story, as I said, becomes our story, which lasts forever, meaning nothing is ever lost. And I think it was the last time I talked about this, someone said, I never thought about that. I never thought about what meaning there is in life exactly. But someone else said, but the non-Christian who was in the audience said it was really good to think about. Like that was really good. Because maybe in the church we don't really think about those things, because we've always kind of been a part of a story, in a sense, or at least like a community that kind of just goes on and on and on. But perhaps we should think about it. And if you even ask someone, if a woman, she was Jewish, she asked me, what religion are you, and why are you that religion? I said, I'm a Christian because I like how it gives me meaning. And then she paused for a while, she went, wait, what? Like, what are you actually saying by that statement? It sounds so strange, but when you explain it, it makes, all the difference. All right, so here, once again, final questions. You can always ask someone if you don't know. How do you know that? What is in your life has affected what you believe? How do you find meaning in life? Like, how do you get to a question like that? Well, this guy, he was into like scuba diving. That's what he was into. He was also in a wheelchair then, but he wasn't. Okay, he came on the plane. I said, what's your occupation at some point? He said, scuba diving. I said, how are you liking that? He said, well, I'm in a wheelchair, so I don't do it anymore. And I felt really stupid. But then he talked about it and kind of edged towards like, that was your thrill. That was your meaning. How do you feel now? And he actually had a really positive answer. But a lot of people you can talk about like their job or their passions and hobbies, and you can get towards that subject of meaning. Do you believe that humans are mostly good? These are all thought-provoking questions that in a postmodern world, they're not going to know how they know that, because if there's no truth, your guess is as good as mine what they'll say, because they're not appealing to a standard of truth which we have. All right, it's shortly after 8 questions. I think I've said enough. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Teacher in the basement, but I appreciate what you shared, and I'm just curious, what would you say to someone who, has a Catholic worldview, believes that there's a God, believes there's purpose, but also believes in purgatory, and believes that we are in purgatory?
Yeah, I asked someone else that question, a Christian, and they always said, like, assurance of salvation is one area you can always go to. Because Catholic, it's not that clear. So after that, there's, appealing to their base of knowledge, which for them would be the tradition of the church and or the Bible. So you could go to their foundational point of truth. You could also show the inconsistency of Catholicism on the assurance of salvation. You could say, you could bring up also, you could give them a verse from the New Testament that Jesus said, and show how it's a life-changing sort of moment in time where you are converted. Because that's something, if you ask a Catholic, I heard one say, like, how do you get to heaven? Well, I guess if you accept Jesus, like a very, I don't know answer. So if you go a little deeper, it's often a culture, not so much an actual tradition of knowledge. So that's about what I know.
I also
Yeah, yeah.
Did he start as just a show, or did something happen at the time?
He had a radical conversion. He attempted suicide and when he was living in India as a teenager, he was in the hospital. He was given a Gideon's Bible. He read the verse, "I live, therefore you also will live," and he converted his life to Christ. And it seemed very genuine. And my idea is that when I listen to his oldest sermons, like it's a little different. Like there's a sermon I listened to a while ago about Isaac and Rebekah. It was really a lot different. Like I didn't think about him. I just thought about what he was saying. But towards the end, and I'm just totally maybe right or wrong on this, but it seemed that he was kind of floating a lot of ideas, saying a lot of quotes, saying things that kind of, it kind of magnified him. That's the only, there was some very concrete things. So Billy Graham famously said, "No member of my staff a male will ever be in a room alone with a woman that is not his wife." And that was never the accountability for him. There was zero accountability. His entire staff, or his entire board, said, "Oh no, that's not possible. He's a righteous man." They had no knowledge of his cell phone usage. They had no knowledge of where he was at. There was no accountability. And if you have a person for decades living on the road, teaching like that over and over and over again into their old age, that tendency, any tendency towards sin, not held accountable, I mean, I don't know, the temptation there. And he even spoke of like how difficult it was during his ministry, how difficult it was to avoid temptation, but he never actually repented. And yeah, it's really hard to believe, but I think accountability was a part of it.
So how do you reconcile someone's ministry like that? Like for me, I don't want to, one like cliche is like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So it's like, it seems like he had a powerful ministry, and I really enjoy listening to Bradley as well. So it's like, okay, at the end of his life, all this stuff comes out, and then what, you just like discount everything and say that was all for naught and have no meaning. I mean, that doesn't really seem right either.
I mean, they've taken down all their information, their website and everything has been, their ministry changed to helping survivors of abuse, or abuse victims, particularly women. I mean, I still quote him in some of these things. I just don't say it's him, because he's actually quoting someone else often. He's often quoting Malcolm Muggeridge and various other people, so of course you could use that. He quoted that poem by Steve Turner, one that he used, and that's not his words. But I mean, his ideas are sound. I mean, one of the biggest things I learned was about religion, or my faith, I guess, was from a secular professor. And he said something really, like, profound, and I thought, wow, that's really true about how we humans think. We're not so objective as we're guided, and our minds are affected by all sorts of things. Particularly, I was thinking of sin and the whole thing he had. So I think his points are valid, but his lifestyle was a complete sham starting at some point.
So I really like how you started out with meaning in life, and one of my questions at the beginning was, what is the number one key to find ongoing meaning in life? And I feel like you really answered a lot of that well. If you have anything to say to older Christians that are struggling.
Yeah, so if your value point is fixed, like a fixed reference point, I mean, that's one thing you can think of. Two thoughts. One, I love that, the Holy Spirit we sometimes associate with emotions, but it's not just that, it's our soul, our spirit, whatever you want to say. It's also called the Spirit of Truth. So I wake up and I'm not in any way feeling the spirit of just happiness and joy. The joy hasn't come yet, but the truth is still there, and I can look at it and go, yes, that's correct, and I'm so glad it is. So that's one thing I thought of earlier this week, but I'm probably losing my thought. If you would give yourself a test, you could do that. Anyway, I've thought of this before. Are you in your faith? Are you drifting? Are you losing your mission? are you becoming motivated by something else? A few things you could think about, like imagine you were sitting at a table and somebody walked up to that table, they sat across from you, and you didn't know anything about them, and you just talked to them. Turns out they were like actually no, I backtrack a little bit. And then you learn that they're business executive at like a good company, I don't know, think of a good company. Goldman Sachs. Anyway, I guess that's good. And you go, wow, and you talk to them in a very different manner because your value system might be saying, you're pretty good. I mean, I would probably that because I think that's like, they own probably my credit card or something, you know, that's amazing. But then you sit there and someone else comes and eventually you learn that they're a juvenile delinquent or a prisoner or something like that. And do you treat them differently after you hear that? Is your value system still where it's like Christ at the top, where I treat everyone without bias? What is my value system? Because if I'm talking to Elon Musk and I think that the top of my value system is invention and corporation and all that and making a difference in the whatever world, I'm going to look at him like the best person there is. But if my value system is based on Christ and is unchangeable to who I talk to, even if someone across on the table turns out to be involved in, a young lady or a lady who sells themselves for a profit, if my attitude and my love is unconditional and fixed on Christ and that value system, and I treat that person the same as I did the first, that's a true mark of Christian or Christ is my identity, not culture, or not a way of life that I've drifted into. That's something I had to think about because there are a lot of people who really are just nasty or look and smell and are just so difficult to get along with. But if my identity is in Christ, that same love, even in spite of the kind of the cringe, should come out. That's one test, I guess, or idea you could think about: unconditional love versus cultural acceptability. All right. Well, tomorrow we'll pick up with the next topic. Thank you for your listening and your questions. I enjoyed it. I hope you did too.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Nick, for speaking once again this evening. So, again, a lot to think about, especially on meaning. So, how do I find meaning in life? The question that Christianity can answer. Do you believe that we have the faith that can answer that question? And being created in the image of God, we can be redeemed. And if we become redeemed, His story becomes our story, which lasts forever, and meaning nothing is ever lost. Again, if we become